The snow fell like tears from a broken sky, each flake carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken prayers. In the wilderness of Colorado Territory, 1884, where hope froze before it could take root, a young woman clutched a crumpled letter in her trembling hands. She had traveled 2,000 miles to marry a stranger, only to find an empty cabin and a grave marked with his name. But what she discovered in that abandoned snow shelter would change not just her life, but the lives of 12 forgotten souls who had been waiting for a miracle. This is the story of how love multiplies when it refuses to surrender. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The stagecoach wheels carved deep ruts through the frozen mud as they rolled into Clearwater Falls, Colorado Territory. The driver's voice cut through the howling wind like a rusty blade. "End of the line, miss. This here's as far as civilization." "Who goes, Margaret Maggie?" Sullivan pressed her face against the frost-covered window, her breath fogging the glass as she strained to see through the swirling snow. At 24, she carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who had learned to find strength in silence. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her green eyes held the weary hope of someone who had bet everything on a single hand of cards. The dress she wore was her finest, a deep blue wool that had belonged to her mother, carefully mended and altered to fit her smaller frame. It was the same dress she had worn when she answered the advertisement in the Boston Herald 3 months ago, the same dress she had packed with trembling hands when she left everything she knew behind. Now, as the stagecoach lurched to a stop, that dress felt like a costume for a play that had already ended badly. Maggie clutched the leather satchel that contained her entire life. 3 other dresses, her mother's Bible, a daguerreotype of her parents who had died in the cholera outbreak of 1878, and most importantly the letters. 17 letters from Thomas Mitchell, the rancher who had promised her a home, a future, and the chance to build something beautiful together. The last letter, dated just 6 weeks ago, spoke of spring plans and the house he was building with his own hands. He wrote of wildflowers that would bloom come April, of cattle that would graze in valleys she had never seen, and of the children they might have together. His words had painted pictures of a life so different from the cramped boarding house in Boston, where she had worked 14-hour days in a textile mill, saving every penny for this journey west. The driver's weathered face appeared at the window, his beard white with frost. "You sure this is where you're getting off, miss? Ain't nothing out here but snow and heartache. Next settlement's another 40 miles north." Maggie nodded, though her throat felt tight with uncertainty. "I'm expected here, Mr. Thomas Mitchell's ranch." Something shifted in the driver's expression, a flicker of recognition followed by what looked suspiciously like pity. He glanced away quickly, spitting tobacco juice into the snow. "Mitchell Place, eh? Well, you'd best talk to Sheriff Barnes first. He'll set you straight on things." The word sent a chill through Maggie that had nothing to do with the Colorado wind. She gathered her skirts and stepped down from the coach, her boots sinking immediately into snow that reached past her ankles. The cold bit through her wool stockings like hungry teeth. Clearwater Falls was hardly more than a collection of wooden buildings huddled together against the vast wilderness. A general store, a saloon with bat-wing doors that swung in the wind, a small church with a crooked steeple, and what appeared to be a sheriff's office with smoke rising from its chimney. The main street was empty except for a few horses tied to hitching posts, their breath steaming in the frigid air. Maggie's heart hammered against her ribs as she made her way toward the sheriff's office, each step crunching through the snow. The sign above the door read, "Sheriff Jacob Barnes," in faded letters. She knocked, her knuckles already numb from the cold. "Come on in before you freeze to death out there." Sheriff Barnes was a man in his 50s with kind eyes and a belly that spoke of his wife's good cooking. He looked up from a stack of papers as Maggie entered, and his expression immediately grew troubled. "You wouldn't happen to be Miss Sullivan from Boston, would you?" Maggie's blood turned to ice. "Yes, I'm here to marry Mr. Mitchell, Thomas Mitchell. He's been expecting me." The sheriff set down his pen and gestured to a chair beside a wood stove. "Sit yourself down, Miss Sullivan. I'm afraid I've got news that ain't easy to hear." The world seemed to tilt sideways as Maggie sank into the chair. The warmth from the stove felt distant, unable to touch the cold that was spreading through her chest. Is Thomas?" "Tom Mitchell was a good man," Sheriff Barnes said gently. "One of the finest ranchers in these parts. But 3 weeks ago, he was bringing cattle down from the high pastures when a blizzard hit. Found him 2 days later, frozen solid. The whole town turned out for his funeral." The words hit Maggie like physical blows. She stared at the sheriff, trying to process what he was saying, but her mind seemed to have stopped working. 3 weeks ago, while she was packing her trunk and dreaming of her new life, Thomas had been dying alone in the snow. "But his letters," she whispered, pulling the bundle from her satchel with shaking hands. "He wrote to me just 6 weeks ago. He was building a house. He was planning." Sheriff Barnes nodded sadly. "Tom talked about you plenty. Said he was finally going to have a real home, not just a bachelor's cabin. He was happier than I'd seen him in years." The sheriff paused, his voice growing heavier. "Miss Sullivan, I don't know what Tom told you about his situation, but he wasn't a wealthy man. That house he was building, it's nothing but a foundation. And some lumber. His cabin's been sitting empty since he died, and his debts. Well, there ain't much left." Maggie felt as though she were drowning. She had spent every dollar she had on the train ticket west. Her job at the textile mill had been filled the day she left. The boarding house had rented her room to someone else. There was literally nothing left for her in Boston. No family, no friends, no future. "I don't understand," she said, her voice barely audible. "What am I supposed to do? Where am I supposed to go?" The sheriff shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Well, there's a few options. The church runs a charity fund for folks in need. Might be enough to get you back east, though it takes some time to raise the money, or—" He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with what he was about to suggest. "There's other men in these parts looking for wives. Good men, mostly. Might be. You could find another arrangement." The suggestion hit Maggie like a slap. Another arrangement, another stranger, another leap into the unknown with nothing but hope and desperation to guide her. She thought of the letters she had written to Thomas, the dreams she had shared, the careful way she had opened her heart to a man she had never met. The idea of starting over, of pretending to feel something she didn't, made her stomach turn. "I need some air," she said abruptly, standing so quickly that her chair scraped against the wooden floor. Sheriff Barnes rose as well. "Miss Sullivan, you can't just wander around out there. The temperature's dropping, and there's another storm coming. At least let me find you a room at Mrs. Peterson's boarding house for the night." But Maggie was already reaching for the door handle. "I just need a moment to think. Please." The sheriff looked like he wanted to argue, but something in her expression stopped him. "Don't go far," he warned, "and don't stay out long. This weather can kill you faster than you'd think possible." Maggie nodded and stepped back into the brutal cold. The wind had picked up, driving the snow horizontally across the street. She pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, but it provided little protection against the elements. Her mind raced as she walked aimlessly through the small town. What was she going to do? She had exactly $3.47 to her name, not enough for a train ticket back to Boston, even if she had somewhere to go when she got there. The idea of accepting charity made her skin crawl. She had worked for everything she had ever had, and the thought of becoming a burden to strangers felt like a betrayal of everything her parents had taught her. As for finding another husband, Maggie shuddered, and not just from the cold. She had been fortunate that Thomas seemed like a genuine man from his letters, someone who wanted a partner rather than just a housekeeper or a broodmare. But how many other men like that could there be? How many more risks could she take with her heart and her future? Lost in her thoughts, Maggie found herself walking beyond the edges of town, following what appeared to be an old mining road that wound up into the hills. The snow crunched beneath her feet, and her breath came in sharp puffs that disappeared immediately in the wind. She should turn back. Sheriff Barnes had been clear about the danger, but something drove her forward. Perhaps it was the need to be alone with her grief, or maybe it was the desperate hope that if she just kept walking, she might somehow find the life that Thomas had promised her waiting at the end of the trail. Whatever it was, she pressed on, even as the snow began to fall more heavily and the temperature continued to drop. The road curved around a stand of pine trees, their branches heavy with snow, and suddenly Maggie stopped in her tracks. There, barely visible through the swirling white, was a structure that looked like it had been built into the hillside itself. It was crude but solid. Rough-hewn logs and stones fitted together to create what appeared to be a shelter. Smoke was rising from what must have been a makeshift chimney. Someone was living there. Maggie hesitated, suddenly aware of how isolated she was, how far she had walked from town. But the cold was becoming unbearable, and she could feel the numbness spreading through her fingers and toes. She needed warmth, and she needed it soon. She approached the shelter cautiously, her heart pounding. The structure was larger than it had first appeared, built partially underground, with only the front wall and roof visible above ground. It looked like the kind of emergency shelter that miners or trappers might use, designed to weather the harshest storms. As she drew closer, she could hear something that made her stop in her tracks. Voices. Children's voices. High and thin, they rose and fell in what sounded like a song, though she couldn't make out the words through the wind. Maggie approached the heavy wooden door that served as the shelter's entrance. Her hand trembled as she raised it to knock, but before she could make contact, the door swung open. A small face peered out at her, a girl who couldn't have been more than 8 years old, with tangled blonde hair and eyes the color of winter sky. The child's clothes were patched and threadbare, but clean, and her expression held a wariness that seemed far too old for her years. "Jenny, who is it?" came another voice from inside the shelter, followed by the sound of rustling and whispers. "It's a lady," the girl called back, never taking her eyes off Maggie. "A pretty lady all covered in snow." More faces appeared behind the first. Children ranging in age from what looked like 6 to perhaps 12 years old. But as Maggie looked more closely, she realized something extraordinary. They were all twins, 6 pairs of children, identical in their features, but each pair unique from the others. "Please," Maggie said, her voice barely audible through her chattering teeth. "I'm lost. I need help." The door opened wider, and an older boy stepped forward, perhaps 12 years old, with the same blonde hair as the first girl, but eyes of a deeper blue. "You're gonna freeze to death out there, lady. Come in." Maggie stepped through the doorway and immediately felt the blessed relief of warmth. The shelter was larger inside than it had appeared from outside, with a low ceiling supported by rough beams and walls that had been lined with salvaged materials, pieces of canvas, old blankets, and what looked like pages from newspapers and books. A fire burned in a stone hearth that had been cleverly built into the back wall, its chimney disappearing up through the roof. The floor was dirt, but it had been packed hard and covered with more salvaged materials to create a reasonably comfortable surface. But it was the children that took Maggie's breath away. 12 of them, arranged around the fire like flowers, turning toward the sun. 6 pairs of twins, each pair clearly related to each other but distinct from the rest. There were the blonde twins who had greeted her, The boy and girl with those striking blue eyes, another pair with dark brown hair and freckles scattered across their noses like constellations. Twins with red hair so bright it seemed to glow in the firelight. A pair with hair so black it held blue highlights and eyes like dark chocolate. Another set with light brown hair that curled at the ends. And finally, a pair who couldn't have been more than 6 years old, with strawberry blonde hair and green eyes that reminded Maggie of her own. They were all thin, too thin, but their eyes were alert and intelligent. They watched her with curiosity rather than fear, though she could see the wariness that came from experience. "I'm Danny," said the oldest boy who had invited her in. He gestured to the blonde girl beside him. "This is my twin sister, Jenny. We're kind of we look after things here." "Look after things," Maggie repeated, still trying to process what she was seeing. "Where are your parents, your families?" A silence fell over the group that spoke louder than words. Danny and Jenny exchanged a glance that held entire conversations. "Ain't got none," Danny said simply. "Haven't for a while now. We look after each other." "But you're just children," Maggie said, sinking down beside the fire without thinking about it. The warmth felt like heaven against her frozen skin. "How long have you been living here? How do you survive?" "We do all right," said one of the red-headed twins, a girl who looked to be about 10. "Danny's real good at catching rabbits, and Jenny knows which plants are safe to eat. We found this place last summer when the Petersons' farm burned down." "The Petersons?" Maggie asked, remembering the name from Sheriff Barnes. "They took us in after—" Danny's voice trailed off, and he seemed to be choosing his words carefully. "After our folks died, different times, different ways. Some sickness, some accidents. The Petersons were good to us, gave us a place where nobody else would take so. Many kids at once." Jenny picked up the story. "But then their barn caught fire during that big storm in August. Spread to the house real quick. Mr. and Mrs. Peterson, they didn't make it out. We barely made it out ourselves," added one of the brown-haired twins, a boy whose voice was rough with memory. "House was burning all around us. Danny got us all out through the back window. The town folks, they wanted to split us up." Danny continued. "Send us to different families, different towns. Some wanted to ship us back east to those big orphanages, but we're family now, you know. We stick together." Maggie felt her throat tighten with emotion. These children had lost everything just as she had, but they had found something in each other that she was still searching for. "So you ran away," she said softly. "We didn't run away," Jenny said with quiet dignity. "We just found our own place." Danny knew about this old mining shelter from when he used to explore with Mr. Peterson. "It's been abandoned for years, but it's solid. Keeps us warm and dry. But winter," Maggie said, looking around at the crude but ingenious ways they had made the shelter livable. "How do you eat? How do you stay warm enough?" "We manage," Danny said, but Maggie could hear the worry underneath his words. "Got plenty of wood, and the older kids take turns keeping the fire going all night. As for food—" He shrugged. "We make do. Jenny's real good at making a little go a long way." Maggie looked around at the 12 faces surrounding her, and her heart broke a little more with each one. They were so young, so brave, so determined to stay together that they were willing to face the brutal Colorado winter in a abandoned mining shelter rather than be separated. And suddenly, as she sat there in the warmth of their fire, surrounded by their quiet courage, Maggie realized something that took her breath away. She had been wrong. Thomas Mitchell's death hadn't left her with nothing. It had brought her exactly where she needed to be. "What are your names?" she asked softly. "All of you. I want to know who you are." One by one, they introduced themselves. Danny and Jenny, the blonde twins, who seemed to be the natural leaders. Sarah and Samuel, the redheads with quick smiles and quicker minds. Emma and Ethan, the dark-haired pair who spoke in whispers but whose eyes missed nothing. Lucy and Luke, the brown-haired twins, who seemed to be the peacemakers of the group, and finally the youngest pair, Rose and Ryan, the strawberry-blonde 6-year-olds who stayed close together and watched everything with wide, solemn eyes. 12 children, 12 souls who had found each other in loss and refused to be separated by a world that saw them as burdens rather than blessings. As the storm raged outside their shelter, Maggie Sullivan made a decision that would change all, their lives forever. She didn't know how she was going to do it, didn't know where she would find the strength or the resources, but she knew with absolute certainty what she had to do. These children needed her, and God help her, she needed them. 2. The journey that had brought her west to marry a stranger had ended in heartbreak. But perhaps, just perhaps, it was the beginning of something even more extraordinary. A family forged not by blood or law, but by choice and love, and the simple determination to never let each other face the world alone. Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The storm outside howled like a wounded animal, rattling the shelter's makeshift windows and sending drafts through gaps in the walls that no amount of patching could completely seal. Inside, the 12 children had settled into what was clearly their nightly routine, the older ones checking the fire, the younger ones curled together on bedrolls made from salvaged blankets and straw. Maggie watched them move with a coordination that spoke of months of practice, each child knowing their role without being told. Jenny quietly counted the day's remaining food, a few pieces of hardtack, some dried berries that must have been foraged months ago, and what looked like the bones from a rabbit that had probably provided their last real meal days earlier. "Miss," Danny said, approaching Maggie with the careful politeness of a child who had learned to be wary of adults. "You can have my share of supper. You look like you ain't eaten in a while." The offer hit Maggie like a physical blow. This boy, who couldn't weigh more than 70 pounds soaking wet, was offering to give up his food for a stranger. She looked into his eyes, too old, too knowing, and saw the kind of selflessness that came from being responsible for others when you were barely old enough to be responsible for yourself. "I'm not hungry," she lied, her stomach cramping with emptiness even as she spoke. "But thank you, Danny. That's very kind of you." He nodded solemnly, accepting her lie with the grace of someone who understood that sometimes kindness required pretending not to see the truth. As he turned away, Maggie caught Jenny's eye. The girl was watching her with an expression that was far too knowing for an 8-year-old. "You're running from something too, aren't you?" Jenny asked quietly, settling down beside Maggie near the fire. "That's why you were walking in the snow without proper clothes. That's why you look like you've been crying." Maggie's throat tightened. These children had seen too much, understood too much about the ways adults could fail and fall. "I suppose I am," she admitted, "though I'm not sure what I'm running to." "Maybe you're not running to anything," said Sarah, one of the red-headed twins, her voice wise beyond her 10 years. "Maybe you're running from one broken thing to another broken thing, and the broken things are supposed to fix each other." The words hung in the air like a prophecy. Maggie looked around at the faces illuminated by firelight, 12 children who had every reason to be bitter, angry, defeated. Instead, she saw something that took her breath away. Hope. Not the desperate, grasping hope of people who had nothing left to lose, but the quiet, steady hope of those who had already lost everything and discovered that love could grow even in the emptiest soil. "How long has it been since you've had a proper meal?" Maggie asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. The children exchanged glances. It was Emma, one of the dark-haired twins, who answered in her soft voice. "Danny caught a rabbit 4 days ago. Before that?" She shrugged. "Jenny made soup from some bones and roots maybe a week back. And before winter set in, we did better then." Luke, one of the brown-haired twins, said proudly. Jenny knows all about which berries are safe, and Samuel, he gestured to one, of the redheads, he's real good at finding bird eggs. During the warm months we hardly went hungry at all, but winter in the Colorado Territory was a different beast entirely. Maggie could see the signs of prolonged hunger in their thin faces, the way their clothes hung loose on their small frames. These children were slowly starving, and they were doing it with such quiet dignity that it made her heart break. "Tell me about the town," Maggie said. "The people there. Do they know you're here?" Danny's expression grew guarded. "Some suspect, maybe, but they don't come looking. Sheriff Barnes, he's a decent man, but he's got his orders about orphans. State says we got to be split up, sent to different families, or shipped back east to those big institutions." "The church folks tried to help after the Petersons died," Jenny added. Mrs. Whitmore, she wanted to take in Rose and Ryan since they're the littlest. Mr. and Mrs. Chen from the general store, they said they might could manage Emma and Ethan, but nobody wanted all of us. "And we ain't splitting up," Samuel said firmly, his red hair catching the firelight. "We promised each other, whatever happens, we stay together." "That's why we came here," Sarah added. Danny remembered this old place from when he used to explore with Mr. Peterson, said it was built solid, would keep us warm and dry. Maggie looked around the shelter with new eyes, seeing not just the crude construction, but the ingenious ways the children had made it livable. Someone had fitted pieces of salvaged glass into the window openings and sealed them with mud and grass. The floor had been covered with layers of pine boughs and salvaged carpeting. Shelves carved into the earthen walls held their few possessions, a handful of books, some tools, cooking implements that looked like they had been rescued from the Peterson farm fire. "You've made it into a real home," she said, and meant it. "Jenny did most of that," Danny said, with obvious pride in his sister. "She's got a real gift for making things nice, even when there ain't much to work with." Jenny blushed but lifted her chin with dignity. "Mama always said a home ain't about how fancy things are. It's about the love that lives inside the walls." "Your mama sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was," Jenny said softly. "Mama and Papa died in the diphtheria outbreak 3 winters back. We would have died too, probably, if the Petersons hadn't taken us in." "And the others?" Maggie asked gently. "How did you all find each other?" It was a story that unfolded slowly, with different children adding pieces like they were building a quilt from scraps of memory. Sarah and Samuel's parents had died in a mine collapse. Emma and Ethan had been abandoned at the church when their father lost his job and couldn't feed them. Lucy and Luke's mother had died in childbirth, and their father had drunk himself to death the following winter. Rose and Ryan's parents had been killed when their wagon overturned, crossing a swollen creek during spring flooding. Each pair of twins had found their way to the Peterson farm through different circumstances, but all had arrived carrying the same burden, the kind of grief that marked children as different, harder to place, less desirable to potential families who wanted uncomplicated additions to their households. "The Petersons never made us feel like burdens," Ethan said quietly. "Bah! Mrs. Peterson, she used to say we were her dozen angels, sent to fill up her house with laughter. They couldn't have children of their own," Emma added. "Mrs. Peterson told us once that God must have known she needed 12 hearts to love instead of just 1 or 2. The fire popped and sparked, sending shadows dancing across the earthen walls. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside the shelter, there was a warmth that had nothing to do with the flames. "What will you do when spring comes?" Maggie asked. "Keep going," Danny said simply. "We'll plant a garden if we can find seeds, maybe build onto the shelter some, make it bigger. Samuel thinks he can trap enough rabbits to get us through next winter if we start smoking the meat early. And if someone finds you, if they try to separate you." The children's faces grew hard with determination that was heartbreaking in its intensity. We'll run again if we have to, Jenny said. We've gotten real good at disappearing when we need to. But running takes energy, Maggie said gently. And energy takes food, and food— She gestured around the nearly empty shelter. You can't keep living on berries and hope. We'll manage, Danny said, but there was a note of desperation under his confidence that he couldn't quite hide. We always have before. Danny, Maggie said, her voice so gentle it was almost a whisper. You're 12 years old. You shouldn't have to manage. You should be in school, learning to read and write and do arithmetic. You should be playing games and getting into trouble and dreaming about what you want to be when you grow up. I know what I want to be, Danny said firmly. I want to be someone who takes care of people, someone who doesn't let his family get split up or sent away. The words hit Maggie like a revelation. Here was a boy who had been forced to become a man before he'd even finished being a child, and he wore that responsibility with a dignity that put most adults to shame. What about the rest of you? She asked, looking around at the other faces. What do you dream about? The answers came slowly, shyly, as if dreaming was a luxury they had taught themselves to live without. Jenny wanted to learn to read better so she could teach the little ones from real books instead of just the few pages they had salvaged. Sarah dreamed of having enough food to share with others who were hungry. Samuel wanted to learn to build things properly with real tools and good lumber. Emma wished for a place where she could keep a garden and grow flowers, not just vegetables for eating. Ethan wanted to learn to write letters so he could tell stories about their adventures. Lucy dreamed of having a dress that was made just for her, not passed down from someone else. Luke wanted to learn to play music, maybe on a fiddle or harmonica. Rose and Ryan, the youngest, simply wanted to stay with their family forever and maybe have a real bed to sleep in. Each dream was heartbreakingly modest, the kind of simple wishes that most children took for granted. As Maggie listened, she felt something shifting inside her chest. A fierce protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. These children had found something precious in each other, something that the adults in their world seemed determined to destroy in the name of propriety and proper procedure. They had built a family out of shared loss and mutual care, and they were willing to starve together rather than be torn apart. I have a confession to make, Maggie said finally, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. I didn't get lost walking in the snow by accident. I came to Clearwater Falls to marry a man named Thomas Mitchell, but when I arrived, I learned that he had died 3 weeks ago. The children listened with the stillness of those who understood the weight of loss. I spent everything I had to. Come here, she continued, every dollar, every connection back east. I have nowhere to go and no way to get there even if I did. So you're stuck here too, Jenny said softly. It wasn't a question. I suppose I am. Maggie looked around at the 12 faces watching her in the firelight. Which means I have a choice to make. I can accept charity from the church and try to find another man to marry, another arrangement that might keep me fed and housed. Or, she paused, her heart hammering as she spoke words that would change everything. Or I can stay here, with 12 children who need someone to take care of them, and see if we can't take care of each other. The silence that followed was so complete that Maggie could hear her own pulse thundering in her ears. The children stared at her with expressions ranging from hope to disbelief to fear. It was Danny who spoke first. You don't know what you're saying, miss. You don't know how hard it is. We ain't got enough food, we ain't got proper clothes for the little ones, and when the town finds out you're here, they'll come after all of us. You're right, Maggie said. I don't know how hard it's going to be, but I know what it feels like to have nowhere to belong and no one to belong to. I know what it's like to be alone in the world. She looked around at their faces, seeing herself, reflected in their eyes, the fear, the hope, the desperate need for someone to choose them. And I know that I'd rather face whatever's coming with 12 brave hearts beside me than face it alone. Rose, the youngest girl, slipped from her place beside her twin brother and padded over to Maggie on bare feet. Without a word, she climbed into Maggie's lap and pressed her small face against Maggie's shoulder. "Does this mean you're going to be our mama now?" Rose whispered. Maggie's arms came around the little girl automatically, and she felt tears she hadn't realized she was shedding drop into Rose's strawberry blonde hair. "If you'll have me," she whispered back. One by one, the other children moved closer, not crowding, but creating a circle that included her. Jenny took her hand. Danny nodded solemnly as if sealing a pact. The twins drew near with the careful hope of those who had learned not to expect too much, but couldn't help wanting it anyway. Outside the shelter, the storm raged on, but inside, something new was being born. Not just a family, but an army. 12 children and one woman who had found each other in loss and were determined to build something beautiful together. They had no money, no legal standing, no guarantee that the world would let them stay together. But they had something that couldn't be bought or legislated or taken away by force. They had each other, and they had love, and sometimes, in the wilderness of the world, that was enough to build miracles from. The fire burned lower as the night deepened, but none of them moved to bank the coals. They stayed close together in their circle, planning and dreaming and beginning to believe that tomorrow might hold possibilities they had never dared to imagine. Maggie Sullivan had come west to marry a stranger and build a conventional life. Instead, she had found 12 extraordinary souls who would teach her that the strongest families aren't born, they're chosen. One brave heart at a time. Dawn came like a whisper through the frost-covered windows of the shelter, painting the earthen walls with pale gold light. Maggie woke to the sound of quiet movement, children rising with the practiced silence of those who had learned not to disturb sleeping siblings in cramped quarters. Her body ached from sleeping on the hard-packed earth, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of wood smoke and pine. But for the first time in months, she had slept without the gnawing anxiety that had plagued her nights since leaving Boston. There was something profoundly peaceful about being surrounded by the soft breathing of children who trusted her enough to sleep in her presence. Jenny was already at the fire, coaxing life back into the banked coals with the skill of someone who had never been able to take warmth for granted. She looked up when she noticed Maggie stirring and offered a smile that was like sunrise itself. "Morning, Miss Maggie," she whispered, careful not to wake the others. "Sleep all right?" "Better than I have in a long time," Maggie admitted, sitting up and pulling her shawl around her shoulders. "How long have you been awake?" "Not long. I always wake up early to get the fire going proper before the little ones get cold." Jenny added another piece of carefully hoarded wood to the growing flames. "We learned real quick that it's easier to keep a fire going than to start a new one." Maggie watched the girl work with movements that were both economical and practiced. Everything about the way these children lived spoke of hard-won wisdom, of lessons learned through necessity rather than instruction. "Jenny," Maggie said softly, "what I said last night about staying, about being a family, did you think I meant it?" The girl's hands stilled on the kindling. She looked at Maggie with eyes that held too much knowledge for someone so young. "Adults say lots of things they don't mean. Sometimes they believe they mean them when they say them, but then morning comes and everything looks different." The words hit Maggie like a gentle slap. These children had been disappointed before, had their hopes raised and then shattered by well-meaning adults who couldn't follow through on their promises. "I meant it," Maggie said firmly. "Every word. But meaning it and making it work are two different things, aren't they?" Jenny nodded slowly. "The wanting to help is the easy part. It's the figuring out how that gets tricky." As if summoned by their quiet conversation, the other children began to stir. Danny was the first to fully wake, his eyes immediately alert and scanning the shelter to make sure everyone was accounted for. It was the habit of someone who had taken responsibility for too many lives at too young an age. Within minutes, the shelter was alive with quiet activity. The children moved through their morning routine with choreographed precision, checking the fire, rolling up bedding, organizing their few possessions. But Maggie noticed something different today. The glances in her direction weren't wary anymore. They were hopeful, expectant. "What do we usually do for breakfast?" Maggie asked, though she already suspected the answer. "Depends on what we got," Samuel replied, his red hair sticking up at odd angles. "Today, we got—" He looked to Jenny questioningly. "A handful of dried berries and maybe enough hardtack for the littlest ones," Jenny said matter-of-factly. "The older kids can wait until later." "No," Maggie said firmly. "Today, we try something different." She reached into her leather satchel and pulled out the small purse that contained her remaining money. $3.47 wasn't much, but it was more than these children had seen in months. "Danny, how well do you know the paths between here and town?" "Like the back of my hand," he said with pride. "I can get there and back without anyone seeing me, if that's what you're thinking." "That's exactly what I'm thinking, but not alone." Maggie looked around at the children's faces. "If we're going to be a family, we're going to start acting like one. That means no one goes hungry if we can help it, and no one faces danger alone." She stood and began pacing the small space, her mind working furiously. "Here's what we're going to do. Danny, you and Samuel know the town best, right? And you've been watching the patterns, when people are in the general store, when they're not." Both boys nodded eagerly. "Then you two are going to come with me to the general store. We're going to buy supplies. Not much, we can't afford much, but enough for proper meals for a few days while we figure out our next move." "But Miss Maggie," Emma said softly, "what if someone sees you with us? What if they ask questions?" It was a valid concern, and one that had been keeping Maggie awake despite her exhaustion. The moment she appeared in town with any of these children, questions would be asked. Sheriff Barnes would want to know where she was staying, how she was supporting herself, and what her intentions were regarding 12 orphaned children. "Then we tell them the truth," Maggie said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I'm a woman who came west to start a new life, and I found 12 children who need someone to care for them. We're figuring it out together." "And when they say, 'You can't keep us all,'" Luke asked. "When they say we have to be split up," Maggie knelt down so she was at eye level with the brown-haired boy. "Then we prove them wrong. We show them that families aren't always made the way people expect, but they can be just as real and just as strong." "How?" Rose asked from her place beside her twin brother. "How do we prove that?" "By being the best family we can be," Maggie said simply. "By taking care of each other, by making sure everyone has enough to eat and warm clothes and someone to listen when they're scared. By showing the world that love makes a family, not paperwork." The children exchanged glances, and Maggie could see them having one of those silent conversations that twins and close siblings seem to master. Finally, Jenny spoke for all of them. "All right, but if this goes wrong, if they try to take us away, we all run together. No one gets left behind." "No one gets left behind," Maggie agreed solemnly. An hour later, Maggie found herself walking the snow-covered path toward Clearwater Falls, with Danny and Samuel flanking her like bodyguards. The boys had insisted on bringing along a crude walking stick that Danny had carved, claiming it was for navigating the icy patches, but clearly intending it as protection if they encountered trouble. The town looked different in the morning light. Less forbidding, more like a collection of buildings where ordinary people lived ordinary lives. Smoke rose from chimneys, and she could see warm light glowing in windows. It looked like the kind of place where neighbors helped neighbors, where community mattered. She hoped that impression was accurate, because she was about to test it. The general store was warm and inviting, with shelves lined with goods that seemed impossibly luxurious after spending the night in the mining shelter. Bolts of fabric, ready-made clothes, tools, books, and best of all, food, barrels of flour and sugar, wheels of cheese, smoked meats hanging from hooks, jars of preserves that caught the light like jewels. Mrs. Chen, the shopkeeper Jenny had mentioned, looked up from behind the counter as they entered. She was a small woman with kind eyes and hair going grey at the temples. Her expression shifted from polite interest to curiosity as she took in Maggie's travelling dress and the two boys beside her. "Good morning," Maggie said, summoning every ounce of confidence she possessed. "I'm Margaret Sullivan. I believe Sheriff Barnes mentioned me yesterday." Recognition dawned in Mrs. Chen's face, followed quickly by sympathy. "Oh yes, you poor dear, the young lady who came to marry Tom Mitchell. I'm so sorry for your loss, though I suppose you never really got to know him properly." "No, I didn't," Maggie agreed. "But I'm trying to figure out what to do next, and I was hoping you might be able to help me." Mrs. Chen's gaze shifted to Danny and Samuel, who were trying their best to look respectable despite their patched clothes and too thin frames. "And these boys are with me," Maggie said simply. We're taking care of each other." Something in Mrs. Chen's expression sharpened. She was clearly a woman who noticed details, who put pieces together quickly. Taking care of each other how, exactly? Maggie had rehearsed this conversation during the walk to town, but facing Mrs. Chen's direct gaze, she found herself abandoning her carefully planned explanations in favor of simple truth. "There are 12 children living in an abandoned mining shelter in the hills," she said quietly. "Orphans who ran away rather than be separated and sent to different families. They've been surviving on their own since the Peterson farm burned." Mrs. Chen's eyes widened. 12 children, living rough through this winter? She looked at Danny and Samuel with new eyes, seeing past their attempts at dignity to the hunger and cold they were trying to hide. "Yes, ma'am," Danny said, lifting his chin with pride. "We take care of each other real good, but Miss Maggie here, she wants to help us do better." "And how exactly do you plan to do that, Miss Sullivan?" Mrs. Chen asked, though her tone was more curious than challenging. "I don't know yet," Maggie admitted, "but I know that splitting them up isn't the answer. They're a family, and families belong together. I thought maybe if I could find work, if I could prove that we can manage." Mrs. Chen was quiet for a long moment, studying Maggie's face with the intensity of someone making an important decision. Finally, she spoke. "My husband and I tried to adopt 2 of those children after the Peterson fire, Emma and Ethan, the quiet ones with the dark hair. We have a good business, a comfortable home, no children of our own." She paused, her voice growing softer. "But when we went to speak with them, they made it clear they wouldn't be separated from the others, all 12 or none at all." "And you couldn't take all 12? Maggie said, understanding. "Couldn't and didn't," Mrs. Chen corrected. "There's a difference. We could have made room, could have found a way to manage, but 12 children, it seemed impossible. Too big, too complicated, too risky." She moved from behind the counter, walking to the window that looked out toward the hills, where the mining shelter lay hidden. "But seeing you here, with these boys looking at you like you hung the moon, maybe impossible things happen when someone's brave enough to try them." Mrs. Chen turned back to face them, and Maggie was surprised to see tears in the older woman's eyes. "What do you need?" Mrs. Chen asked simply. "Food," Maggie said immediately. "Enough to keep them fed while I figure out the rest. I have a little money, not much, but—" Mrs. Chen waved her hand dismissively. "Money we'll worry about later. Right now, let's get those children fed properly." What followed was a whirlwind of activity that left Maggie dizzy with gratitude. Mrs. Chen moved through her store like a general organizing supplies for a campaign, pulling items from shelves with practiced efficiency, oatmeal and dried fruit for healthy breakfasts. Salt pork and beans, that would stretch into hearty dinners, fresh bread that was still warm from the bakery next door, milk and cheese that would provide the growing children with needed nutrition, warm blankets that had been ordered for another customer but could be replaced, and most importantly, hope. "Mrs. Chen," Maggie said as the pile of supplies grew higher, "I can't possibly afford all this." "Consider it an investment," Mrs. Chen replied briskly. "My husband and I have been watching this town turn its back on those children for months. We've felt guilty about it, if you want the truth. Maybe this is our chance to do something right." Danny and Samuel stood transfixed as Mrs. Chen continued to add items to their growing pile. New socks for the little ones, soap for washing, even a few pieces of penny candy that she slipped in when she thought no one was looking. "But there are conditions," Mrs. Chen said as she began wrapping the supplies in brown paper. "I want to meet all 12 children. I want to see this shelter they're living in, and I want your word that if this doesn't work out, if you can't manage, you'll come to us before you let those children go hungry again." "You have my word," Maggie said, solemnly, as they prepared to leave the store, arms laden with more food than the children had seen in months. Mrs. Chen caught Maggie's arm. "There's something else you should know," she said quietly. "Word is already spreading that you're in town, that you're asking questions. Some folks are curious, some are supportive. But others—" She glanced toward the saloon across the street. "Others think you're a troublemaker. They're saying you're interfering with official business, encouraging those children to stay hidden instead of accepting proper placement." Maggie's heart sank. She had hoped for more time before facing opposition from the community. "Who's saying that?" "Harold Grayson, mainly. He's on the territorial council, thinks he runs this town. He's been pushing to have those children rounded up and sent to the state orphanage in Denver. Says it's for their own good, but—" Mrs. Chen's expression grew hard. "Harold Grayson has never done anything for anyone's good but his own. What will he do when he finds out about me? Probably try to have you arrested for interfering with official business, or claim you're unfit to care for children because you're unmarried and have no visible means of support." The words hit Maggie like ice water. She'd been so focused on the immediate needs of the children, food, warmth, basic survival, that she hadn't fully considered the legal challenges they would face. "Mrs. Chen," she said slowly, "what would it take to make this legal? To make me their official guardian?" The older woman shook her head sadly. "More than you have, I'm afraid. You'd need to prove stable income, suitable housing, moral character references. And even then, the territorial authorities prefer to place orphans with established families or send them to institutions where they can receive proper care and education. So what you're saying is that no matter how well we manage, no matter how much we love each other, the law is against us." "I'm saying the law as it stands doesn't account for families like the one you're trying to build," Mrs. Chen corrected gently. "But laws can be changed, Miss Sullivan. Sometimes they have to be when they don't serve the people they're meant to protect." As they walked back toward the hills with their precious cargo of food and supplies, Danny and Samuel chattering excitedly about the feast they were bringing home, Maggie felt the weight of the challenge ahead settling on her shoulders. She had found 12 children who needed her, and they had accepted her into their makeshift family with a trust that humbled her. But wanting to protect them and being able to do it were two very different things. The law was against them. The community was divided. They had no money, no official standing, no guarantee that tomorrow wouldn't bring officials determined to scatter them to the winds. But they had something else, something that Harold Grayson and his territorial council couldn't legislate away. They had love that multiplied instead of divided, courage that grew stronger when shared, and the kind of stubborn hope that could move mountains one pebble at a time. As the mining shelter came into view, smoke rising from its chimney like a promise of warmth, Maggie heard the sound of children's laughter carried on the wind. 10 voices raised in joy at seeing their brothers return safely, 10 hearts beating with anticipation for the good news written on Danny and Samuel's faces, 12 children and 1 woman against the world. The odds were impossible, but then again, so was love itself, and sometimes, in the vast wilderness of human experience, impossible things happened when someone was brave enough to believe they could. The celebration in the shelter that evening was unlike anything Maggie had ever witnessed. 12 children who had grown accustomed to gnawing hunger now sat around a table fashioned from old planks, their faces glowing in the firelight as they shared the first real meal they'd had in weeks. Jenny had transformed Mrs. Chen's supplies into a feast that would have made a palace chef proud. Salt pork simmered with beans in a pot that had somehow been salvaged from the Peterson farm fire. Fresh bread, still soft despite the cold journey from town, was torn into generous portions. The milk, carefully rationed but not hoarded, was shared in tin cups that had been polished until they gleamed. But it wasn't the food that made Maggie's throat tight with emotion. It was the way Rose and Ryan, the youngest twins, kept looking up at her between bites as if to make sure she was real, that she hadn't vanished like so many other good things in their young lives. It was how Samuel and Sarah, the red-headed twins, had insisted she take the first and largest portion, their generosity as natural as breathing. It was the way all 12 children had somehow managed to make room for her in their carefully choreographed life, accepting her not as an intruder, but as a missing piece they hadn't known they were waiting for. "Tell us about Boston," Emma asked softly, her dark eyes curious. "Was it very grand?" Maggie considered the question carefully. These children had lived their entire lives in the vast spaces of the Colorado Territory, where the sky stretched endlessly and the nearest neighbor might be miles away. How could she explain the suffocating closeness of tenement buildings, the gray smokestacks that blocked out the sun, the way people could live stacked on top of each other and still be desperately lonely? "It was crowded," she said finally. "So many people that sometimes you felt invisible even when you were surrounded by them. The buildings were tall, reaching up toward the sky, but they blocked out most of the light." "Sounds awful," Luke said, with the frank honesty of a 10-year-old. "Parts of it were," Maggie agreed, "but I learned things there that I hope will help us here. I can read and write well. I know how to keep accounts, how to manage household expenses. I learned to sew in the textile mill, so I can mend clothes and maybe even make new ones if we can get the fabric." "Could you teach us?" Jenny asked eagerly. "Reading and writing, I mean. We know some from Mrs. Peterson and the little bit of schooling we got, but—" "We want to learn everything," Ethan added, speaking up more than usual. "Danny says if we're going to stay together, we need to be smart about it. Smart enough to take care of ourselves no matter what happens." The words hit Maggie with unexpected force. These children weren't just surviving, they were planning for a future, preparing themselves to face whatever challenges lay ahead. There was a resilience in them that spoke of something deeper than mere stubbornness. It was hope, carefully tended and fiercely protected. "I'll teach you everything I can," Maggie promised, "but you'll teach me things too. You know this land, these seasons, how to find food and shelter and make a life in places where most people would perish. We'll learn from each other." As the evening wore on and the younger children began to yawn, Maggie found herself caught up in the bedtime routine that had clearly been refined over months of practice. Rose and Ryan were tucked into a nest of blankets near the warmest part of the shelter, with Lucy and Luke close by to watch over them. Emma and Ethan claimed a corner where they whispered quietly to each other in the language that twins seemed to develop naturally. Sarah and Samuel settled near the fire, taking the first watch to keep the flames steady through the night. Jenny and Danny, as the unofficial leaders of the group, made a final check of the shelter, testing the security of the door, making sure the ventilation holes weren't blocked with snow, organizing supplies for the morning. Watching them work together with such practiced efficiency, Maggie felt a pang of sadness for the childhood they had never been allowed to have. "Danny," she said quietly as the boy settled onto his own bedroll, "what you've done here, taking care of everyone, keeping them together, it's extraordinary." The boy's face flushed with embarrassment. "Wasn't just me. Jenny does most of the real work, the cooking and mending and making sure everybody feels all right when they're scared. I just make sure nobody tries to hurt us." "And how often does someone try to hurt you?" Danny and Jenny exchanged one of their silent communications. It was Jenny who answered, her voice carefully neutral. "Town folks mostly leave us alone because they don't know exactly where we are. But sometimes hunters or trappers come through and they don't always have good intentions toward children on their own." Maggie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Colorado. "A winter. What do you mean?" "Some folks think children without families are free for the taking," Danny said bluntly. "Think they can put us to work for nothing or worse. That's why we learn to be so careful about who we trust." The casual way he spoke about such threats made Maggie's stomach turn. These children had been living in constant danger, not just from hunger and cold, but from predators who saw their vulnerability as opportunity. "Well, you don't have to worry about that anymore," she said firmly. "Nobody's going to hurt you while I'm here." "But what if you're not here?" Rose asked in a small voice from her nest of blankets. "What if something happens to you like it did to Mama and Papa Peterson?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Maggie realized that these children had learned not to take anyone's presence for granted. They had lost parents, guardians, and each other in various ways. The idea of permanent safety was foreign to them. "Then you'll take care of each other, like you always have," Maggie said gently. "But Rose, sweetheart, I'm not going anywhere, I promise you that." "Adults always say that," Ryan whispered, "but they don't always get to choose. Out of the mouths of babes." 6-year-old Ryan had learned a truth that many adults spent their whole lives avoiding, that promises of permanence were often beyond anyone's power to keep. "You're right," Maggie said, surprising them with her honesty. "I can't promise that nothing bad will ever happen, but I can promise that as long as I draw breath, I will fight for this family. And if something does happen to me, I'll make sure. There are people who know about you, who will help you, who won't let you face the world alone." It wasn't the reassurance they wanted, but it was the truth, and somehow that seemed to comfort them more than empty promises would have. The next morning brought visitors. Maggie woke to the sound of horses and voices outside the shelter. Danny was already at the small window, peering through a gap in the salvaged curtains that Jenny had hung for privacy. "3 men," he reported quietly. "Sheriff Barnes, and 2 I don't recognize. Fancy dressed, not local." Maggie's heart hammered as she quickly smoothed her hair and checked her appearance. She had expected this confrontation, but not so soon. Word traveled fast in small towns, and her appearance with the boys at Mrs. Chen's store had clearly reached the wrong ears. "Children," she said quietly but firmly, "remember what we talked about. We're a family. We take care of each other. Nobody gets separated, nobody gets left behind." 12 pairs of eyes looked back at her with a mixture of fear and determination. They had been through this before, officials coming to break up their family, to drag them back to a world that saw them as problems to be solved rather than people to be loved. The knock on the door came exactly as Maggie had expected it would. Authoritative, impatient, the kind of knock that assumed it would be answered immediately. Maggie opened the door to find Sheriff Barnes flanked by 2 men in dark suits and expensive coats. City men, she realized immediately, the kind who carried themselves with the authority of those who made decisions about other people's lives from the comfort of offices far away. "Miss Sullivan," Sheriff Barnes said, his voice carrying a note of regret. I'm afraid we need to talk. Of course, Maggie said, stepping aside to let them enter. Please, come in out of the cold. The two city men surveyed the shelter with expressions that mixed distaste with professional assessment. Maggie could see them cataloguing every detail, the crude construction, the makeshift furniture, the children pressed together like birds. In a storm. I'm Harold Grayson, the taller of the two men said without preamble, Territorial Council member responsible for child welfare in this district. This is Mr. Edwin Morse, representative of the Colorado Territorial Authority. Both men spoke as if their titles were shields, as if the weight of official position could substitute for human decency. Maggie had met their type before in Boston, men who wielded bureaucracy like a weapon, who confused process with justice. Gentlemen, Maggie said with as much dignity as she could muster, I'm Margaret Sullivan. These are my children. Your children? Grayson's eyebrows rose skeptically. Miss Sullivan, according to our records, you arrived in Clearwater Falls 3 days ago as a mail-order bride to a deceased man. You have no legal standing, no established residence, no visible means of support. These children are wards of the territorial government. These children, Maggie said, her voice growing firmer, are a family. They've been taking care of each other since the Peterson farm burned. They belong together. Morse stepped forward, pulling a leather portfolio from his coat. Miss Sullivan, I have placement orders here for all 12 children. Good families. Throughout the territory have agreed to take them in. They'll receive proper housing, education, and moral guidance. Separate families, Jenny said quietly, the first time any of the children had spoken since the officials arrived. Naturally, separate families, Grayson confirmed. No family can reasonably be expected to take in 12 orphans at once. These children will be placed in homes that can properly provide for their needs. Their need, Danny said, his young voice, carrying surprising authority, is to stay together. We're brothers and sisters. We promised each other. Grayson's expression grew harder. Young man, children don't get to make such promises. Adults make decisions about what's best for children's welfare. And what adult decided it was best to let them live in an abandoned mining shelter all winter? Maggie asked, her own authority rising to meet his. What adult decided it was acceptable for children to go hungry while proper families couldn't? Be bothered to help? Miss Sullivan, Morse interjected, you're being emotional rather than practical. These children need structure, education, proper moral guidance. Living in this cave with an unmarried woman of questionable background is hardly appropriate. Questionable background. Maggie felt her temper flare. I worked 14 hours a day in a textile mill to save money for a better life. I can read and write and cipher. I know how to manage a household and stretch resources to feed a family. What exactly is questionable about that? You're unmarried, Grayson said, as if that explained everything. You have no established income, no suitable housing, no community standing. You're asking us to place 12 children in the care of a woman who is herself essentially destitute. The words hit their mark, but Maggie refused to flinch. I'm asking you to leave 12 children with someone who loves them rather than split them up among strangers who see them as charity cases. Sheriff Barnes, who had remained silent during the exchange, finally spoke up. Harold, these children have been managing on their own for months. They're healthy, they're fed, they're clearly devoted to each other. Maybe we should consider Sheriff Barnes, Grayson cut him off sharply. Your job is to enforce the law, not to make policy. The law is clear. These children are to be placed in appropriate homes immediately. He turned back to Maggie, his expression brooking no argument. Miss Sullivan, you will gather whatever possessions these children have. Transport will arrive this afternoon to take them to their new placements. No. The word came out harder than Maggie had intended, but she didn't soften it. I won't help you destroy this family. Then you'll be arrested for interfering with official business, Morse said coldly, and the children will be removed anyway. A. Silence fell over the shelter that seemed to stretch forever. 12 children looked at Maggie with eyes that held every disappointment they had ever suffered, every broken promise, every time an adult had failed them when they needed help most. But underneath the fear, she saw something else. Trust, hope, the quiet faith that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. "Mr. Grayson," Maggie said, her voice steady despite the storm raging in her chest, "you say the law requires these children to be separated. But what if there was another option? What if someone was willing to provide the stable home, the proper housing, the established income you require?" Grayson's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that you give me 30 days to prove that I can provide everything you say these children need. 30 days to establish income, secure proper housing, demonstrate that we can function as a legitimate family." "And if you fail?" Morse asked. Maggie looked around at the 12 faces that had become her world, her purpose, her heart. "If I fail, I won't fight the separation. But if I succeed, you leave us alone. All of us, together, as a family." The officials exchanged glances. It was clearly not the response they had expected. 30 days, Grayson said finally, but with conditions. Weekly inspections, proof of adequate food, shelter and supervision, any sign that these children are at risk, and they're removed immediately. "And at the end of 30 days, Morse added, if you can't demonstrate stable income and appropriate housing, the children are placed according to our original plan. No appeals, no delays." Maggie felt the weight of 12 futures pressing down on her shoulders. 30 days to build a miracle out of hope and determination. 30 days to prove that love could triumph over bureaucracy. "Agreed," she said, as the officials prepared to leave. Sheriff Barnes lingered behind. When the others were out of earshot, he leaned close to Maggie. "You got guts, Miss Sullivan, I'll give you that. But Harold Grayson doesn't make bets he expects to lose. He's already got those placement orders signed and sealed. In his mind, he's just giving you enough rope to hang yourself with." "Then I'll have to make sure I don't hang," Maggie replied. After the officials left, the shelter felt different. The air itself seemed charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. 12 children looked at Maggie with expressions that mixed. Hope with terror. "Can you really do it?" Rose asked in a whisper. "Can you really make us a proper family that the law people will accept?" Maggie knelt down to meet the little girl's eyes. "Rose, sweetheart, I don't know if I can, but I know I'm going to try, with everything I have." "What do we do first?" Danny asked, already shifting into his role as protector and helper. Maggie stood and looked around at the faces of her chosen family. 30 days to build a life that would satisfy territorial authorities. 30 days to prove that 12 orphaned children and 1 mail-order bride could create something beautiful and lasting and legally acceptable. "First," she said, "we make a plan. Then we get to work. And then we show Harold Grayson and his territorial authority that families aren't made by paperwork. They're made by people who refuse to give up on each other." The battle for their future had officially begun, but as Maggie looked at the determination in 12 pairs of young eyes, she realized that she had just enlisted the most powerful army she could have asked for. An army of love, bound together by promises that no law could break and no official could dissolve. 30 days to build a miracle. It would have to be enough. The morning after the official's visit dawned crisp and bright, with sunlight streaming through the shelter's small windows like liquid gold. But the beauty of the day couldn't mask the weight of the challenge ahead. 30 days to transform 12 orphaned children and a destitute mail-order bride into a family that would satisfy territorial bureaucrats who had already decided they were destined to fail. Maggie sat at the makeshift table with a piece of paper and a stub of pencil, trying to work out the impossible mathematics of their situation. On one side of the paper, she listed what they had: love, determination, 12 pairs of willing hands, and exactly $2.31 remaining from her journey west. On the other side, she tried to calculate what they needed: proper housing for 13 people, steady income, adequate food, suitable clothing, and somehow the miracle of making it all legal. The numbers didn't add up. They weren't even close. Miss Maggie? Jenny appeared at her elbow, studying the paper with the intense concentration of someone who had learned to read upside down during long evenings around shared books. What are all those figures for? I'm trying to figure out how to build us a life that Mr. Grayson will accept, Maggie said honestly. And right now, the arithmetic isn't working in our favor. The other children began to gather around the table, drawn by the serious tone in Maggie's voice. Danny leaned over her shoulder, his brow furrowed as he studied her calculations. You wrote down proper house, cost unknown, he observed. But what if we didn't have to buy a house? What if we built one ourselves? Danny, building a house takes materials, tools, knowledge. I know how to build, Samuel interrupted, his red hair catching the morning light. Mr. Peterson taught me before the fire. I can frame walls and lay a foundation proper. And I know about roofing, added Luke. Helped fix the Peterson barn roof 3 times before it burned. Emma's real good with measurements, Ethan said, his dark eyes serious. She can figure out how much wood and nails we'd need for anything. Maggie looked around at the earnest young faces surrounding her. These children, who had been dismissed by adults as burdens and problems, were offering skills and knowledge that could be the foundation of their salvation. All right, she said slowly, feeling the first stirring of something that might have been hope. Let's say we could build our own house. Where would we build it? We'd need land. What about Thomas Mitchell's land? Jenny asked. You came here to marry him. Doesn't that mean you have some claim to his property? The question sent a jolt through Maggie. She had been so focused on survival that she hadn't thought about the legal implications of her intended marriage to Thomas. I don't know, she said. Sheriff Barnes mentioned that Thomas died with debts, that there wasn't much left. But there was something left, Danny said thoughtfully, and you came all the way from Boston to marry him. Seems to me that ought to count for something. We need to find out exactly what Thomas left behind, Maggie decided, and whether I have any legal claim to it as his intended bride. I could ask around town, offered Sarah. People like talking to children sometimes when they won't talk. To adults, they think we don't understand important things. That's a good idea, but it might be dangerous, Maggie said. If Harold Grayson finds out we're asking questions about property claims, then we'll be careful, Sarah said with a maturity that broke Maggie's heart. We've gotten real good at being invisible when we need to be. As they talked, a plan began to take shape. It was audacious, probably impossible, and certainly risky, but it was a plan. While Maggie would investigate Thomas Mitchell's estate and her potential legal claims, the children would begin preparing for the construction of their own home. The older boys would scout locations and assess what materials might be available. The girls would inventory their current possessions and determine what they would need to establish a proper household. Everyone would contribute their skills and knowledge to the seemingly impossible task of building a legitimate life in 30 days. But first, Maggie said, we need to address the most immediate problem. Mr. Grayson is expecting weekly inspections, starting in 3 days. This shelter won't pass his standards for proper housing. So we make it better, Emma said quietly. It was unlike her to speak up so boldly, but her dark eyes held determination. We clean everything until it shines. We organize our things so it looks proper. We show them that we can make any place into a real home. Emma's right, Jenny agreed. It's not about the walls around us. It's about how we take care of each other inside them. The next 3 days passed in a whirlwind of activity that would have impressed a regiment of soldiers. The children threw themselves into the task of transforming their rough shelter into something that might satisfy an official inspection with an energy that seemed to multiply rather than divide when shared. Danny and Samuel reinforced the makeshift furniture using techniques they had learned from Mr. Peterson to create sturdy tables and benches from salvaged lumber. Sarah and Lucy organized their few possessions with military precision, creating neat storage areas that maximized their limited space. Emma and Ethan worked together to improve the ventilation and lighting, using mirrors and reflective surfaces, to bring more natural light into the underground rooms. But it was Jenny who performed the real magic. Working with materials that most people would have dismissed as worthless, she transformed the crude shelter into something that approached comfortable. Blankets became curtains that provided both privacy and warmth. Salvaged fabric was sewn into cushions that made the hard benches bearable. Even the earthen walls were covered with paper and cloth, arranged in patterns that were almost decorative. Rose and Ryan, the youngest, contributed in their own way by keeping spirits high. Their laughter rang through the shelter as they played games that turned work into joy. Their innocent delight in small improvements infectious enough to keep the older children motivated when the tasks seemed overwhelming. Meanwhile, Maggie made her own journey into town, this time alone and with a specific purpose. She needed to find out about Thomas Mitchell's estate, and she needed to do it without attracting Harold Grayson's attention. The Territorial Land Office was a small building next to the general store, presided over by a clerk named Benjamin Walsh, who looked like he had been born behind a desk and never ventured far from it. He was a thin man with ink-stained fingers and spectacles that perpetually threatened to slide off his nose. Thomas Mitchell's property? Walsh repeated when Maggie made her inquiry. Yes, I remember that case. Sad business, really. Tom was a good man, but he wasn't much of a businessman. What happened to his land after he died? Walsh pulled out a thick ledger and began flipping through pages covered with precise handwriting. Let's see. Mitchell owned 160 acres under the Homestead Act. Good land, most of it, with water rights to the creek that runs through the eastern section. But he had debts. What kind of debts? Hardware store for building supplies, bank loan for cattle, medical bills from when he broke his leg 2 winters back. Walsh's finger traced down a column of figures. Total debt came to about $400. Maggie's heart sank. $400 might as well have been $4,000 for all her ability to pay it. However, Walsh continued, the property itself was valued at nearly $600. After the debts were settled, there should have been something left. Should have been? Walsh's expression grew uncomfortable. Well, that's where things get complicated. The territorial authorities seized the property to satisfy the debts, but they also claimed additional fees for processing, storage, legal costs. By the time they finished calculating what was owed, there was nothing left. That seems convenient, Maggie said, her voice carefully neutral. Miss Sullivan, Walsh said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. I've been keeping records in this territory for 15 years. I've seen a lot of estates settled, and I've never seen fees add up so quickly or so completely as they did with Tom Mitchell's property. The implication was clear. Someone had manipulated the process to ensure that Thomas's estate would revert to territorial control rather than passing to his intended bride. Who handled the estate settlement? Maggie asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Harold Grayson, Walsh confirmed, in his capacity as Territorial Council member for property disputes. Of course. Grayson had not only blocked her potential claim to Thomas's land, he had profited from doing so. The property would now be available for territorial sale to buyers who could afford to pay cash for development. Mr. Walsh, Maggie said carefully. If someone were to challenge that settlement, what would they need to prove? Walsh removed his spectacles and cleaned them nervously. Hypothetically speaking, they would need to demonstrate that the fees were excessive or improperly calculated. They would also need to prove standing to make such a challenge. Standing? Legal right to contest the settlement. A wife would have such standing, or a legal heir, but a mail-order bride who never actually married. He shrugged helplessly. Maggie left the land office with her mind racing. Grayson had not only stacked the deck against her current family, he had systematically eliminated her potential resources as well. The 30-day deadline was looking less like an opportunity and more like a cruel joke. But as she walked back toward the hills, where 12 children waited for her return, Maggie found herself thinking about something Benjamin Walsh had said. A wife would have standing to challenge the settlement, or a legal heir. What if there was another way to approach this problem? What if instead of trying to prove she could support 12 children as a single woman, she could change the fundamental equation entirely? The idea that began to form in her mind was so audacious that it took her breath away. But as she considered it from every angle, she realized it might be their only real chance. When she arrived back at the shelter, she found the children putting the finishing touches on their transformation of the space. The change was remarkable. What had been a crude survival shelter 3 days earlier now looked like a home. Not a wealthy home, certainly, but a clean, organized, loving home where a family clearly lived and thrived together. Miss Maggie rose, ran to greet her, throwing small arms around Maggie's waist. Look what we did! Jenny made curtains, and Danny fixed the wobbly table, and Emma figured out how to make the lamp brighter. The pride in the little girl's voice was unmistakable. These children had taken ownership of their space, their family, their future in a way that no amount of bureaucratic paperwork could capture or duplicate. It's beautiful, Maggie said, and meant it. You've all done something extraordinary here. Did you find out about Mr. Mitchell's land? Danny asked with the directness of someone who had learned not to waste time on pleasantries when important matters were at stake. I did, Maggie said, and I learned that Harold Grayson has been working against us from the beginning. He made sure I could never claim Thomas's property, just like he's trying to make sure I can never claim you children. The faces around her grew solemn. They had all learned hard lessons about the ways powerful adults could manipulate systems to hurt the powerless. So what do we do? Jenny asked quietly. Maggie looked around at the 12 faces that had become her world, her purpose, her heart. The idea she had conceived on the walk home was dangerous, potentially disastrous, and completely unprecedented. It would require courage from all of them, and trust in something that had no guarantee of success. But sometimes, when conventional solutions were impossible, unconventional ones became not just viable, but necessary. We're going to do something that Harold Grayson will never expect, Maggie said. We're going to change the rules of the game entirely. She gathered them around the newly repaired table, their faces illuminated by lamplight, and began to explain a plan that would either save their family or destroy any hope they had left. But as she spoke, watching hope kindle in 12 pairs of eyes, Maggie realized that they had already accomplished something that Harold Grayson and his territorial authority could never understand. They had proven that families weren't created by law or legitimized by paperwork. They were forged by choice, strengthened by shared struggle, and made unbreakable by love that refused to be divided by bureaucratic mathematics. The inspection was tomorrow. The real test of their plan would come soon after. But tonight, in a transformed shelter that had become a home, 13 people who had found each other in loss prepared to fight for the right to stay together. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it as a family. And sometimes that was the only victory that truly mattered. The knock came at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, as precise and unforgiving as a judge's gavel. Harold Grayson stood in the doorway of the transformed shelter, his expensive coat dusted with snow, his expression already set in the lines of someone who expected to find failure and was prepared to document it thoroughly. Behind him stood Edwin, Morse with his leather portfolio, and surprisingly Sheriff Barnes, whose presence seemed reluctant but official. The three men filled the entrance to the shelter, their formal authority a stark contrast to the warm domesticity that the children had worked so hard to create. "Gentlemen," Maggie said with as much dignity as she could muster, stepping aside, to welcome them into what had become unmistakably a home. "Please, come in out of the cold." Grayson's eyes swept the interior of the shelter with the calculating assessment of someone looking for violations rather than improvements. But even his predetermined disapproval couldn't entirely dismiss what the children had accomplished. The space was clean, organized, and filled with the unmistakable warmth of a place where people cared for each other. The 12 children stood in a carefully arranged line, their faces scrubbed clean, their patched clothes neat and tidy. They had rehearsed this moment, knowing that first impressions would matter enormously, but more than their appearance, it was their bearing that caught attention. The quiet dignity of young people who knew their worth despite what the world might say about their circumstances. "Mr. Grayson," Jenny said with perfect politeness, stepping forward with the grace of a natural hostess, "would you care for some coffee? We keep a pot warm for visitors." The offer clearly surprised the territorial official. He had come expecting to find children cowering in squalor, not a young girl offering refreshments with the confidence of someone running a proper household. "That won't be necessary," Grayson said, recovering his official demeanor. "This is an inspection, not a social call." "Of course," Jenny replied with unruffled composure. "We understand. We're proud to show you our home." The word home hung in the air with deliberate emphasis. Not shelter, not hideout, not temporary arrangement. Home. Morse opened his portfolio and began making notes as the officials moved through the space. They examined the sleeping arrangements, tested the structural integrity of the furniture, checked the food storage and cooking facilities. Everything they saw contradicted their expectations of chaos and neglect. "The ventilation system is quite ingenious," Sheriff Barnes observed, studying the carefully placed air holes and the chimney system that kept the underground space from becoming smoky or stale. "Emma designed that," Samuel said proudly, gesturing toward his dark-haired friend. "She's got a real head for figuring out how air moves and how to keep it fresh." Emma blushed, but lifted her chin with quiet pride. "I just noticed that the Peterson house always stayed comfortable even in summer because of the way Mr. Peterson built the windows to catch the breeze." Grayson's frown deepened as he realized that these children weren't just surviving, they were thriving, learning, applying knowledge in ways that demonstrated intelligence and adaptability. It was becoming harder to argue that they were neglected or endangered. "What about education?" Morse asked, clearly grasping for something to criticize. "These children should be in school, receiving proper instruction. We have lessons every evening," Danny said respectfully. "Miss Maggie teaches us reading and writing and arithmetic. And we teach each other things too. About the land, about building and fixing things, about taking care of people." "Show them," Maggie said quietly. Rose, the youngest, stepped forward and began to recite a poem about the changing seasons. Her 6-year-old voice clear and confident. Ryan followed with a mathematical problem that he solved aloud, explaining his reasoning as he worked through the steps. One by one, the children demonstrated reading, writing, and calculation skills that would have impressed the teachers at many frontier schools. "This is adequate," Grayson said grudgingly, "but hardly a substitute for proper institutional education." "What institution?" Ethan asked with genuine curiosity. "There's no school in Clearwater Falls that takes children from the hills. The nearest real school is 40 miles away in Carson City. The observation hit home. These children were receiving more consistent education in their underground shelter than they would have access to in most frontier placements. As the inspection continued, it became increasingly clear that the officials were witnessing something they hadn't expected and didn't know how to categorize. The children were healthy, well-fed, educated, and obviously devoted to each other and to Maggie. The living space, while unconventional, was clean, warm, and functional. By any reasonable measure, this was a family that was succeeding against impossible odds. But Harold Grayson was not a reasonable man when his authority was challenged. "Miss Sullivan," he said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration, "while I admit that the immediate living conditions are acceptable, the fundamental problems remain. You have no legal standing as guardian to these children. You have no established income, no permanent housing, no community support structure." "Actually," Maggie said, her heart hammering with the audacity of what she was about to attempt, "I may have a solution to those problems." She moved to the small table where she had placed a bundle of papers the night before. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up the documents, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Gentlemen, I'd like you to meet my intended husband." The words fell into the shelter like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that touched every person present. The children stared at Maggie with expressions of confusion and betrayal. Had she decided to abandon them after all? Had her promises been as empty as all the others? "Miss Sullivan," Grayson said slowly, "what are you talking about?" "I came to Colorado Territory to marry Thomas Mitchell," Maggie continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "His death prevented that marriage, but it didn't invalidate my intention or my commitment to building a life in this community." She held up the first document, a letter of character reference. "This is from Reverend Marcus Thompson of the First Presbyterian Church in Boston, attesting to my moral character and suitability for marriage and motherhood." The second document was more complex. "This is a certificate of intent to marry, signed by Thomas Mitchell before his death and witnessed by Mrs. Chen at the general store when Thomas asked her to hold it for safekeeping until my arrival." Grayson's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "A certificate of intent proves nothing. The man is dead." "You're right," Maggie agreed. "Thomas Mitchell is dead, but his legal obligations to me as his intended bride were inherited by his estate." She pulled out the third and most crucial document. "According to territorial law, when a homesteader dies, leaving an intended spouse who has traveled substantial distance to fulfill a marriage contract, that spouse has the right to claim what is called widow's provision from the estate, even without a completed marriage ceremony." Benjamin Walsh stepped through the doorway of the shelter, his arms full of legal documents and his ink-stained fingers trembling with nervous excitement. "Forgive the intrusion," the land office clerk said breathlessly, "but Miss Sullivan asked me to research the legal precedent for her situation, and I found several cases that support her claim." Grayson's face went white, then red, then white again. "Walsh, what are you doing here?" "My job, Mr. Grayson. Miss Sullivan has discovered that the fees assessed against the Mitchell estate were calculated incorrectly. The territorial authority overcharged by nearly $200, which means there are substantial assets that should have been held in trust for his intended widow." The legal documents Walsh spread on the table painted a picture of bureaucratic error or deliberate manipulation that could not be easily dismissed. The fees charged for processing Thomas Mitchell's estate had been excessive by any reasonable standard, and the hurried sale of his property had been conducted without proper notification to his intended bride. "Furthermore," Walsh continued, gaining confidence as he spoke. Miss Sullivan's certificate of intent, combined with her documented journey to fulfill the marriage contract, gives her legal standing to challenge the estate settlement and claim what is rightfully hers. This is preposterous, Morse sputtered. You cannot simply manufacture legal claims from thin air. We're not manufacturing anything, Maggie said firmly. We're following territorial law as it was written to protect people exactly like me, immigrants who made substantial sacrifices to build lives in the frontier. She looked around at the children, who were beginning to understand what she was attempting. Their expressions shifted from confusion to amazement to something approaching awe. If I can establish my legal claim to Thomas Mitchell's estate, Maggie continued, I will have the resources to provide proper housing, established income, and community standing for my family. Your family? Grayson asked sharply. My adopted family, Maggie clarified. Territorial law also provides for the adoption of orphaned children by suitable guardians who can demonstrate the means to provide for their welfare. The audacity of the plan was breathtaking. Maggie wasn't just challenging the officials' authority to separate the children. She was using the territory's own laws to legitimize their family and secure their future. Even if your legal theory has merit, Grayson said, his voice dangerously quiet, the process of challenging an estate settlement takes months. You have 30 days. Actually, Benjamin Walsh said, consulting his notes, territorial law provides for expedited review of estate settlements when evidence of administrative error is presented. Given the clear documentation of excessive fees and improper notification, the territorial court could order immediate restitution. Sheriff Barnes, who had remained quiet throughout the exchange, finally spoke up. Harold, if there's evidence that the territorial authority made errors in settling Tom Mitchell's estate, don't we have an obligation to investigate? We have an obligation to follow proper procedures, Grayson snapped, not to chase after legal fantasies invented by desperate women. It's not a fantasy, Maggie said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had found her ground and was prepared to defend it. It's territorial law. The same law you claim gives you the right to separate these children, gives me the right to claim my inheritance and adopt them legally. The shelter fell silent as the implications of Maggie's gamble sank in. She had turned the tables completely, using the bureaucratic system against itself. Instead of begging for mercy as an unfit guardian, she was demanding justice as a legal heir, with rights that predated the official's authority over the children. This will never work, Grayson said, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. Maybe not, Maggie admitted, but while we find out, these children stay together, and if it does work, you'll never have grounds to separate them again. The children looked at Maggie with expressions that mixed disbelief with dawning hope. She had found a way to fight the system from within the system itself, to use law instead of sentiment, procedure instead of pleading. I'll need to consult with the territorial court, Morse said reluctantly. This is unprecedented. Unprecedented doesn't mean impossible, Walsh observed quietly. Sometimes the law provides solutions that no one expects to use. As the officials prepared to leave, clearly unsettled by this unexpected turn of events, Grayson made one final attempt to regain control of the situation. Miss Sullivan, even if your legal theory has merit, you'll still need to prove you can provide adequate care for 12 children. The court will require evidence of stable housing, sufficient income, proper education. Then we'll provide that. Evidence, Maggie said calmly. We'll build the house, establish the income, create the life that satisfies every legal requirement, and we'll do it together, as a family. After the officials left, the shelter erupted in a chaos of questions, explanations, and gradually dawning excitement. The children had witnessed something extraordinary, an adult who not only refused to abandon them, but had found a way to fight for them using weapons the system itself had provided. Miss Maggie, Danny said, his voice full of wonder. "Did you really find a way to keep us all together?" "I found a way to try," Maggie corrected gently. "It's going to be dangerous and difficult, and there's no guarantee it will work. But it's a chance, which is more than we had this morning." "What do we do now?" Jenny asked. Maggie looked around at the 12 faces that had become her world, her purpose, her heart. The plan she had conceived was audacious beyond reason, but it was their only real hope. "Now we get to work," she said. "We have a house to build, a legal case to prove, and a family to save, and we have exactly 23 days to do it." Outside the shelter, snow began to fall again, but inside, the warmth of determination burned brighter than any fire. They had found their weapon in the fight for their future, the law itself, turned against those who had tried to use it to destroy them. The real battle was just beginning. But for the first time since Harold Grayson had walked into their lives, they had hope that victory was possible. 23 days. That's what remained when Harold Grayson and his officials departed from the shelter, their certainty shaken, but their determination intact. 23 days to build not just a house, but a legal fortress that could withstand the full weight of territorial bureaucracy. But Maggie had underestimated the power of what she had unleashed. Word of her legal challenge spread through Clearwater Falls like wildfire, and with it came something she had never expected: allies. The first to arrive was Dr. Marcus Holloway, the town physician who had delivered half the children in the territory, and buried too many of the other half. He appeared at their shelter on the morning after the inspection, his medical bag in one hand and a carpenter's toolbox in the other. "Miss Sullivan," he said without preamble, "I hear you're planning to build a house big enough for 13 people in 3 weeks. That's either the most ambitious project this territory has ever seen or the most foolish. Either way, I figure you could use some help." Behind Dr. Holloway came others. Mrs. Chen arrived with her husband and a wagon load of building supplies. "Consider it an investment in the future," she said simply. "This town needs more people who refuse to give up on each other." Thomas Wright, the blacksmith, brought tools and hardware. "Tom Mitchell was my friend," he said gruffly. "If he intended you to have his land, then by God you should have it." Even more surprising was the arrival of 3 men from the lumber camp 10 miles north of town. They had heard the story from someone who had heard it from someone else, and they came with an offer that took Maggie's breath away. "We got wood," their foreman, a giant named Big Jim Patterson, announced. "Good timber, already cut and seasoned. And we got men who know how to raise a house fast when it needs raising fast." "I can't pay you," Maggie said honestly. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to pay you." Big Jim spat tobacco juice into the snow and grinned. "Lady, we heard about them 12 youngsters taking care of each other all winter. We heard about you coming out here to marry a dead man and staying anyway to fight for kids that ain't even yours by blood. That's payment enough right there." What followed were the most extraordinary 3 weeks in the history of Clearwater Falls. The project that began as a desperate gamble became a community endeavor that revealed the best of frontier spirit. Neighbors who had barely spoken to each other found themselves working side by side, united by the simple conviction that families belonged together. The children threw themselves into the construction with an energy that amazed the adults. Danny proved to have an intuitive understanding of structural engineering, directing the placement of support beams with the confidence of someone twice his age. Samuel worked alongside the lumber camp veterans, his red hair bright in the winter, sun as he learned to notch logs and fit joints with precision that earned grudging respect from men who had been building all their lives. The girls proved equally capable. Emma's mathematical mind made her invaluable for calculating materials and measurements. Jenny organized work crews and meal schedules with the efficiency of a military quartermaster. Sarah and Lucy managed the constant flow of supplies and volunteers, somehow ensuring that the right materials arrived at exactly the right time. Even the youngest children contributed. Rose and Ryan appointed themselves official water carriers, making sure the workers stayed hydrated, their cheerful voices calling out, "Water, fresh water," became the soundtrack of the construction site. But it was the evenings that revealed the true magic of what was happening. After the day's work was done, volunteers would gather around the fire that had been built near the construction site, sharing meals and stories that bound them together into something larger than a building project. Dr. Holloway told tales of medical emergencies where neighbors had risked everything to help each other. Mrs. Chen shared stories of immigrants who had found new families in frontier communities. The lumber camp men spoke of loggers who had died in each other's arms, creating bonds stronger than blood. And through it all, the house rose from Thomas Mitchell's land like a promise being kept. It was not a fancy house. There was no money or time for fancy, but it was solid, spacious, and filled with the love of dozens of people who had chosen to believe that families were worth fighting for. Meanwhile, Benjamin Walsh worked tirelessly on the legal case that would determine whether any of the physical construction mattered. He had uncovered a paper trail of corruption that reached far beyond Thomas Mitchell's estate. Harold Grayson had been systematically manipulating property settlements for years, enriching the territorial authority while impoverishing the families he was supposed to serve. "It's brilliant in its simplicity," Walsh explained to Maggie one evening as they reviewed documents by lamplight. "Grayson waits for homesteaders to die, then inflates the administrative costs until the estate is worthless. The territory seizes the property for unpaid fees, then sells it to developers at market prices." "How many families has he cheated?" Maggie asked. "At least a dozen that I can document. Probably more." Walsh's ink-stained fingers traced through ledger entries that told stories of dreams destroyed by bureaucratic greed. "But your case is different. You have standing to challenge the settlement, and you have community support that Grayson can't ignore." The community support was indeed extraordinary. A petition began circulating in Clearwater Falls, signed by everyone from the bank president to the saloon keeper, attesting to Maggie's character and her fitness to serve as guardian to the 12 orphaned children. Dr. Holloway provided medical examinations showing that all the children were healthy and well cared for. The local minister offered character references that praised the family's devotion to each other and to their community. But Harold Grayson was not finished fighting. On the 18th day of the project, when the house was nearly complete and the legal case was gaining momentum, he arrived with reinforcements. This time he brought not just Edwin Morse, but a federal marshal named Clayton Burke and a territorial judge named William Sterling. The message was clear. The full weight of government authority was being brought to bear against one woman and 12 children who had dared to challenge the system. "Miss Sullivan," Judge Sterling said as he surveyed the construction site, "I understand you've been making some extraordinary claims about your legal rights in this territory." "Not extraordinary at all, Your Honor," Maggie replied, her voice steady despite her hammering heart. "Simply rights that exist under territorial law for anyone brave enough to claim them. Rights that you're claiming give you authority over. 12 orphaned children who should properly be wards of the territorial government. Rights that give me authority over my own adopted children," Maggie corrected. "Children who have chosen me as their guardian, just as I have chosen them as my family." Judge Sterling was a thin man with grey whiskers and eyes that had seen too much of frontier justice to be easily impressed. But as he watched the children working alongside community volunteers, building not just a house, but a life together, something in his expression shifted. "These children," he said slowly, "they seem remarkably capable." "They are," Maggie said proudly. "They've been taking care of each other since the Peterson farm burned. They've survived a Colorado winter in an abandoned mining shelter. They've learned to read and write and calculate. They've built a family out of nothing but love and determination. And you believe you can provide better care than established institutions designed for orphaned children. It was Danny who answered, stepping forward with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned his authority through sacrifice. "Your Honor," the 12-year-old said respectfully, "those institutions want to split us up, send Sarah and Samuel to one family, Emma and Ethan to another, Rose and Ryan somewhere else entirely. They say it's for our own good, but we know better. We're stronger together than we could ever be apart." "And Miss Sullivan," Judge Sterling asked, "what does she provide that these institutions cannot?" "She sees us," Jenny said simply. "Not as problems to be solved or burdens to be carried, but as people who matter, people worth fighting for." Judge Sterling walked through the nearly completed house, examining the craftsmanship, testing the structural integrity, observing the way. The children moved through the space with obvious familiarity and pride. In the largest room, he paused before a wall where 13 names had been carved into the wood in careful script. Margaret, Danny, Jenny, Sarah, Samuel, Emma, Ethan, Lucy, Luke, Rose, Ryan, and in the center, larger than the rest, the word family. Who carved this?" he asked quietly. "We all did," Rose said, her 6-year-old voice proud and clear. "Everyone got to carve their own name. Miss Maggie said that way the house would always know who belonged here." The judge stood in silence for a long moment, his hand tracing over the carved names. When he turned back to face the group, his expression had changed entirely. "Mr. Grayson," he said finally, "I've reviewed the documentation regarding the Mitchell estate settlement. Mr. Walsh's research appears to be thorough and accurate." Grayson's face went pale. "Your Honor, surely you're not going to legitimize this charade based on clerical errors?" "I'm going to legitimize it based on territorial law," Judge Sterling interrupted sharply. "Law that you, as a territorial council member, should have been following all along." He pulled out a legal document and began to read. "By the authority vested in me by the Colorado Territorial Government, I hereby order the immediate restitution of assets improperly seized from the estate of Thomas Mitchell. Furthermore, I recognize the legal standing of Margaret Sullivan as his intended widow and rightful heir to said estate." The words hit the construction site like lightning. Volunteers stopped working, children stopped playing, and even the wind seemed to pause in respect for the moment that would change everything. "Additionally," Judge Sterling continued, "I hereby grant Miss Sullivan's petition for guardianship of the 12 orphaned children in her care, finding that they are healthy, well-educated, and clearly thriving under her protection." The cheer that rose from the construction site could probably be heard in the next county. 12 children rushed toward Maggie, surrounding her with hugs and tears and laughter that spoke of dreams finally fulfilled. Community volunteers embraced each other with the joy of people who had witnessed something extraordinary. Even Big Jim Patterson, the giant lumber camp foreman, was seen wiping his eyes with the back of his massive hand. But it was Harold Grayson's expression that Maggie found most satisfying. The man who had wielded bureaucratic power like a weapon, who had grown rich by exploiting the grief of widows and orphans, stood defeated by the very system he had corrupted. "This isn't over," he said quietly. But his threat carried no weight. His authority had been broken not by violence or political maneuvering, but by a simple application of justice that revealed his corruption for what it was. "Yes, it is," Maggie said firmly. "It's over because we refuse to let you destroy families anymore. It's over because this community has chosen to stand with love instead of law, with hope instead of bureaucracy." As the sun set over the Colorado Territory that night, 13 people sat around the dinner table in their new house. A house built by the hands of friends, legitimized by the law itself, and blessed by the kind of love that multiplies when It's shared. The mail-order bride who had come west to marry a stranger had found something far more precious, a family forged not by blood or law, but by choice and courage, and the simple determination to never let each other face the world alone. 12. Orphaned twins had become an army of love, and they had won the only victory that truly mattered: the right to stay together, to grow together, to build a future where no child would ever again have to choose between family and survival. Outside their windows, the Colorado wilderness stretched endlessly toward tomorrow, full of challenges and possibilities they couldn't yet imagine. But they would face them together, all 13 of them, bound by promises that no law could break and no official could dissolve. They had proven that families weren't made by paperwork. They were made by people who refused to give up on each other, one brave heart at a time. In the end, that was the only miracle they had ever really needed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.